Okay, let's see if I can knock out another video on the First Seminole War. The background behind me is Fort Gaines. And we're going to talk about letters received by the Secretary of War and the War Department, First Seminole War, in June and July 1818. On June 13th, 1818, Jackson's pretty much done with his rampage, destroyed the town of Miccosukee, captured Fort St. Mark's, built Fort Gadsden, went over and captured Pensacola. And June 13th, 1818, General Gaines is writing to John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, from Fort Scott in southwest Georgia. Gaines says he has received from Major Twiggs at Fort Gadsden that 47 Ocheesee Indians have arrived. Nearly 70 men and women and children of the Ocheesee have surrendered at St. Mark's in April, and they may be of the same group. Gaines says he's heard of no hostile bands on the Occoquan River. A small party of friendly Indians returned from Miccosukee towns and found fresh trails with cattle going to the Swanee River. Peter McQueen's tribe is on the Swanee and planting corn. The Miccosukee and Foultown Indians are somewhere in East Florida. After Foultown was destroyed, most of those Indians went to Miccosukee to the southeast. They're somewhere in East Florida. Bulllegs and the Black Seminoles are between Alachua and Tampa Bay, where they should have plenty of corn, cattle, and rice. Yellow Hair, that's a Friendly Creek chief. Governor Call says his hair was jet black, has brought in 12 head of horses left by the Army. 14 other horses have been brought in by friendly Indians, left by the Tennessee Volunteers, and in a very reduced state. They'll probably not survive. They are ordered to be fed and used for wagons or artillery. See if they can get some work out of those horses. On June 14th, 1818, General Gaines writes to John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, from Fort Scott. He says there's a problem with the rejection of the account of Captain Hardin from Camp Montgomery for payment of forage due to it being a permanent post. Gaines argues in favor of issuing forage due to the requirements of service that required the officer to be in the field as his duties. The forage was needed as there was none available otherwise. Originally, the Army intended to graze off what the Indians left behind, but found out they didn't have anything. During the Seminole War, one of Gaines's horses, as well as 100 other horses, died of starvation. Gaines does not see how Fort Montgomery could be considered a permanent fort either, given its condition and remote location. It's in southeast Alabama. The previous order did not specify which post they were at, but required soldiers to be mounted, and there's no other source of forage available. Rations had to be ordered from New Orleans at great expense. And there's included a note on the suspending forage payment for Captain Hardin. 2 weeks later, General Gaines, on June 28th, 1818, writes from Fort Gaines to the commanding officer at Fort Scott. The towns of the Eufaula and Okeechobee have divided provisions with families of hostile warriors, with several of the towns, Red Ground, Dry Creek, and others. So they spread along their rations on those friendly ones and the ones who have surrendered. Says you'll order the Eufaula, Miko, and Onosajo chiefs of the towns to be furnished with 6 barrels of flour and 3 barrels of salt pork and 4 gallons of salt, which they will divide equally among those who are in most want. Should the supply at Fort Scott be too limited, additional supply should be ordered from Fort Gadsden. Also, June 28th, 1818, General Gaines from Fort Gaines to commanding officer at Fort Scott, certified by Adjutant James Glassell. The towns of Eufaula and Oconee have supplied provisions to the suffering families of hostile warriors who have come into their towns, supply them with barrels of flour and pork, gallons of salt for provision, draw from Fort Gadsden if needed. The next day, up in Nashville, James Gadsden, I think he's working as the adjutant at this point, writes to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, says that General Jackson's health prevents him from replying. Captain Gadsden is preparing a report on the defense of the Florida frontier as soon as it is completed, and will repair to Washington City to report to the War Department. Also, June 29th, 1818, back down south, General Gaines at Fort Gaines writes to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, says the hostile chief Miccosukee has been executed. He was a Miccosukee chief, reported by the principal chief of the Eufaula town from reports that the women and children of the hostile party have taken refuge among friendly Indians of the Eufaula and Oconee. Their corn and provisions have been eaten and they suffer from hunger. I've ordered a small supply from the contractor store from Fort Scott for these towns. The court martial of Colonel Brearsley affords evidence of failure of the contractor to show that purchases made by my order were unavoidable and proper. I am setting out for Alabama. Gaines writes again from Fort Gaines, also June 29, 1818, to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. I received a report of the principal chief of Eufaula town as warriors met with a notorious hostile chief called Miccosukee near the settlement upon this river and killed him. Many of his warriors had previously left him and returned to the friendly part of the nation. The women and children have taken refuge among the Eufaula and Oconee. Their corn and provisions have been eaten up, and they've ordered a small supply from the contractor's store at Fort Scott. The proceedings of General Court Martial with Colonel Lindsay as present in the case of Colonel Brearsley afford evidence of the late failures of the contractor upon this frontier and will show that my purchases were unavoidable and proper. Next, James Gadsden writes to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. He says that the attack on the Chehaw village, when became known, the arrest of Captain Wright was issued, the man who perpetrated the attack. No other officer's name was known, and Captain Wright was the commanding officer who was held responsibly. Interference of the civil authorities in Georgia caused his escape. The safety of the southern frontier demands that justice be done for the friendly tribe of Indians that can be purchased to ensure conviction and punishment of the individual who has outraged humanity and caused such a stigma on our national character. The trials recommended by agent of the Creek Nation and would be a mere mockery, so they don't expect justice to happen. Eventually, one of the other officers would be captured and punished, but Captain Wright escapes and is never seen again. June 30th, 1818, Benjamin Smith to General Jackson in Nashville. After Jackson's return from Fort Gadsden, he was told by William MacIntosh, son of the Creek Agency, that cattle taken from the Seminoles were given to General William MacIntosh to be given to Creek chiefs and warriors of the nation, and were taken to Fort Scott, where Mitchell bought them at a fine dollar, contrary to your orders. So MacIntosh took the cattle that had been captured by the Seminoles and got with Indian agent David Mitchell got with his son William Mitchell, and they sold them for profit instead of giving them to the starving Indians. Andrew Jackson to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun writes from Nashville: during the recent campaign, large droves of cattle were captured from the enemy, which were a reasonable supply for my army. The cattle and younger calves were preserved with orders to be given to General MacIntosh in equal distribution among the other chiefs and warriors of the nation, knowing how much they had suffered during the last war. I've written to General MacIntosh and Mitchell on the subject. And then Jackson, then also on July 8th, 1818, writes to William MacIntosh from Nashville. After the capture of Pensacola, I was taken severely ill, which prevented me from writing to you. I returned to Nashville and was ill again, and have just recovered sufficiently to write you. From my march from Fort Gadsden to Pensacola, I received intelligence of a wanton and outrageous attack by Captain Wright, commanding a detachment of Georgia militia on the Chehaw village. I immediately sent the Chehaws a talk, which you have seen, and ordered Captain Wright to be apprehended and conferred to trial. Major Davis executed this order, and Captain Wright was arrested. In Milledgeville, Captain Wright was released by the civil authorities. I'm waiting interactions from the president and have no doubt justice will be done. I am just informed that a large portion of the cattle you drove from the Seminole territory and were to have been distributed among the Creek Nation have instead been sold and brought by young Mr. Mitchell, son of General Mitchell, your agent. If this is true, then it's not right and the sale is illegal and void. You were in the service of the United States, and all the cattle taken from the enemy were by law the property of the United States and were to have been delivered to the upper creeks. You were destitute of stock and their children in want of milk. I gave the order that after my army was rationed with beef, all the surplus cattle then taken from the enemy should be delivered over to your nation and equally distributed. Further orders the cattle seized. Jackson orders the cattle seized and delivered to the nation. Same day, July 8th, 1818, General Jackson writes to General David Mitchell, the Creek agent: I have been informed that your son has taken the cattle that was captured from the Seminoles and given to General MacIntosh to be distributed among the Creek Nation and sold to them. As adjutant of the friendly Creeks, he was well informed of my orders for the cattle, which he violated. By strict rules of the United States, that cattle were property seized and belonged to the brigade of friendly Creeks, many of the upper Creeks whom were destitute since the last war, and many of the poor were still without milk for their children. I ordered the cattle captured from the Seminoles given to General MacIntosh to be evenly distributed among the chief and warriors of the nation, and to save the calves and milk cows for the women and children. Major Mitchell was well acquainted with the affair. If the sale has been made, it is illegal, and it's ordered that the cattle be collected as property of the United States to be distributed equally by my orders. This may easily be effected, as Mr. Ben Smith informs me that your son, Major Mitchell, has told him that he has bought 500 head, which he has brought to the agency. July 20th, 1818, Major General Gaines from Camp Montgomery to Captain Estes, Deputy Quartermaster, reports that the accounts are still not settled, notwithstanding a great amount of cash was put in his hand. Gaines requests that the vouchers be looked into, as he has reported over $75,000. Should there appear to be deficiency in the reports, Captain Melvin of Fort Hawkins is to place Lieutenant Kaiser under arrest. If it is correct, you'll prepare the reports correctly and assist Lieutenant Kaiser with correcting the reports. Apparently the books were fixed on the accounts and there's unaccounted money and goods not received. So That was June and July of 1818 from the adjutant. Letters sent to the Army Secretary of War and the Army War Department. And I'll continue the list. I have one more video to do. And we'll see it next time.